we have to caveat what we see on Telegram and other social media. Obviously, a lot of that is part of the larger information environment and the larger information war between Russia and Ukraine. And that means we are probably just getting a fraction of what's actually happening, right? If we see a successful FPV drone strike on the tank or on the trench, right, we don't see 8, 9, 10 other attempts that have failed.
This is Dan Meiji, CEO of Firestorm, and this week on the Drone Wars podcast, we have Sam Bendett, one of the foremost experts in open source information regarding the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. You're really going to like this week's podcast. We're going to break it into multiple parts because there's so much information here. Sam Bendett is truly one of the top 5 people in the world I look to when it comes to how things are happening in the open source spectrum when it comes to the war in Ukraine and Russia. As a native Russian speaker, and someone who used to live there, he is able to provide a pretty interesting and unique perspective. And then, the understanding of how the war is being projected online. He's going to tell us about how the war changes kind of once a quarter and how both sides are adapting, some faster, some slower. Anyways, I think you're really going to like today's episode. Sam is a wealth of information, and, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Sam, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure.
It's good to see your face. We originally met, 6 or 7 months ago, I think, in Kiev during a
Poland,
conference.
Actually, Warsaw.
Yeah, you're right. It was in Warsaw, not in Kiev. I was going to say
actually,
Krakow.
no, it was it Warsaw? Was it Krakow?
It was Krakow. That was
Krakow. Yes.
My wrong city with a K. I've really enjoyed kind of following what you put out on the open source community. Like, if you guys don't follow him on Twitter and LinkedIn, you need to. But let's kind of get started with the show today. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your very unique background.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. My full-time job is with CNA, Center for Naval Analyses, where I am a member of the Russia Studies program. I do open source public analysis of how Russian military fights, how it builds weapons, what are the tactics and systems it's using, what are the concepts. On the Russia team, I essentially follow the development of Russian unmanned systems, robotics, autonomy, and AI. And of course, when the war started, I started doing it on a regular daily basis. And of course, now I follow the Ukrainian developments as well. I wear several hats. I also have non-CNA affiliations. I'm affiliated with Center for New American Security, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that does a lot of great tech work. I am an adjunct senior fellow with them, and I'm also an adjunct fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, another think tank in Washington, D.C., where I'm affiliated with their Russian Eurasia program. So I concentrate mostly on Russia as adversarial research, and obviously within our analysis of the war in Ukraine, I also look at the Ukrainian developments too.
How did you kind of find yourself in these roles?
So it's interesting. Prior to joining CNA, I was working for the National Defense University at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., where I was a member of the team that looked at the emergence of new technologies for government assistance in disaster response. So this was a military project, the DoD project, that looked at how aerial drones, commercial drones, crowdsourcing, social media. This is 2009, 10, and 11 when, for example, Twitter started really blowing up as a source of information. How crowdsourcing and other concepts can really aid government, make government response more accurate, make government more responsive to information and data that has been collected in disasters. And so that's where I actually learned about the rise of the commercial drones and the commercial quadcopters for ISR and for other applications. But in parallel with that, I always followed the developments in Russia and in the Russian Federation and in the former Soviet space, and especially Russian military developments. So when I was hired at CNA in 2016, those two kind of converged. My background as a Russia researcher and my background as someone who looks at the emerging and disruptive technologies for all kinds of applications.
Mm-hmm. And so what's been pretty unique, I think, for a lot of Westerners It's just how much of the war you can almost watch in real time or on a very slight delay, right?
Exactly.
Let's talk about Telegram because I mean, the joke used to be the war will be televised live, and now it's like the war will be televised on Telegram.
It will be brought to you second by second by second. We have to caveat what we see on Telegram and other social media. Obviously, a lot of that is part of the larger information environment and the large information war between Russia and Ukraine. So oftentimes we do see successful strikes, successful attempts, successful technologies, for most part. And that means we are probably just getting a fraction of what's actually happening, right? If we see a successful FPV drone strike on the tank or on the trench, right, we don't see 8, 9, 10 other attempts that have failed.
Right.
But at the same time, there's just so much out there. And what has become really unusual is that the information is coming from units themselves, from soldiers themselves, from low-level commanders themselves. It's coming from volunteers who assist both militaries, the Ukrainian volunteers, the Russian volunteers. It's coming from startup and technology efforts that go to the front and work with the soldiers and deliver that technology and test that technology. So it is really a very unusual information space for two conventional militaries. And when I say that, I usually caveat that by saying both Russian and Ukrainian militaries are legacy Soviet militaries. And in some ways, they still carry those legacy problems with them, and they publicly discuss them, obviously. But a lot of the developments that we're probably going to discuss today and that you can see on Telegram are not top-bottom approaches. They didn't come from the MOD, the Ministry of Defense. They didn't come from the large defense industrial enterprises. Of course, many did, but many did not. They came from the bottom up. They came from the soldiers themselves, from the volunteers, from the startups. And a larger sort of effort, this groundswell of activity to plug capability gaps that existed both for Ukrainians and Russians at the onset of the war. And these efforts continue today in different forms and different formats.
Well, talk to us a little bit, and maybe some folks are not as up to speed with the pace of change, right? But it seems like it's getting faster by the week. I'd love to hear kind of your take on just how fast things are changing.
One of the Russian government officials who is now rebranded himself as the volunteer in Ukraine and leads a volunteer detachment says that the war changes every 3 months. And on the ground level, there are changes probably every several weeks or so. Why? And that's because the adversary can quickly adapt, can quickly choose something else to counter a certain technology, to counter the advantage. And these changes basically go in a seesaw pattern. As soon as an advantage is developed by one adversary, a counter advantage is developed by another adversary, right? The countermeasures are developed. They take time to adapt. The adversary adapts to the countermeasures and develops something else, and so on and so forth. And I think in many ways, this is possible because a lot of the changes in combat, these rapid changes, which respond to the needs of the soldiers and those at the front, a lot of those are based on commercial tech. Yep. Which still forms a very significant part of many technologies used at the front by Ukrainians and the Russians. And that makes China essentially the silent partner in this war. Most of the FPV drones, the absolute majority of DJI quadcopters and Autel quadcopters, lots of components from which commercial type multi-rotor and quadcopter drones are built, are still built with parts and components that could be sourced from China very easily and very quickly and in very, very large numbers. And because you can get access to commercial tech, because you can tinker with commercial technologies, you can make changes much, much more rapidly, much faster than any official defense industrial enterprise can. But break. This is where some of the problems come in as well, because there's a lot of tension right now, especially in Russia, between those startups and volunteer efforts that can very quickly pivot and meet the need from the soldiers and build something for them, but they can't scale up this technology. And this technology is unproven, uncertified. while the military and the official defense industrial enterprises, right, they take a long time to certify and test their technology and system, and then they test it out in different modes, and then it goes into the services after some time, right? Those defense industrial enterprises are usually not as quick to pivot and meet the demand. So what has to happen, and what did happen, is the convergence of the best practices from the military industrial enterprises and these startup volunteer efforts that form a very significant portion of a lot of technologies used at the tactical level. This convergence isn't perfect and it is not complete, but it is already happening. And Ukraine is facilitating it via the Brave One platform that was launched recently, which enables, for example, domestic startups to test their technologies for the military, and for the military to test it, to select what works, to make iterations and changes, and then accept it into service. Russians are trying to copy those practices and have their own sort of accelerators as well. This is why the changes can happen so quickly. But I think one of the biggest questions that I definitely would like to get an answer to is, how did those militaries, both militaries, actually just allow these technologies to exist at the front? Because a lot of the stuff we're seeing today was basically formed on or made or acquired on a self-initiated basis, especially on the Russian side, that quickly discovered that they weren't going to have their way with Ukraine and that the war was going to be long, and they need technologies they simply didn't have, like commercial quadcopters or tactical quadcopters, right? In 2022 and 2023, or FPV drones from 23 onwards that we're seeing today. So a lot of this came from the soldiers, a lot of this came from the units themselves, and in some ways, the official military structures did not stand in the way of these processes. That, again, was not a perfect process, because on the Russian side, there's been a lot of obstacles by the military that didn't understand what these small technologies were, what these tactical drones were, what these FPV drones were, because they were military-grade products that were built and tested and certified for multi-use operations, for one-way attack operations, but they were military products. They were the stuff that people could, quote-unquote, actually believe in.
Right.
These commercial technologies that we're talking about weren't really used for the war, right? They weren't designed for the war, and they came with lots of vulnerabilities. So soldiers began tinkering to fix those vulnerabilities, to get rid of those vulnerabilities in one form or another, and to build and iterate. And in the process, they mobilized the civil society on both sides. And that's what we're seeing on Telegram right now. We're seeing whole of all of society, whole of country, people from all walks of life, building drones, assembling drones, sending money, building UGVs, electronic warfare, jamming systems, counter-UAS systems. They are delivering supplies. They are traveling to the front themselves. They're armoring commercial vehicles for the soldiers, and so on and so forth. And again, the military basically allows it because it has nothing to substitute that with if it prohibits those initiatives.
Drone Wars is recorded from Firestorm's global headquarters in San Diego, California. Each episode is filmed inside our X-Cell, a modular industrial-grade manufacturing facility designed to be deployed anywhere in the world within 24 hours for on-demand drone production. Each week on the podcast, we bring you cutting-edge insights from unmanned industry leaders. Listen as they share the breakthroughs and technologies they're working on, the hard lessons they've learned, and the bold predictions about what the next 5 to 10 years in unmanned systems and advanced manufacturing have in store for us. Enjoying the show so far? Then be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Now back to the show. Sam, when was the inflection point? When did we really see this both on the Ukrainian and then on the Russian side, where they realized the material and systems and ways in which they were going to fight, traditional maneuver warfare, was maybe not going to work in this conflict, and we got to start bringing in more commercial technologies? Was that a year ago? Was it 6 months ago? Was it 18 months? What do you think?
I think 2022 is the year when this was realized. And as the conflict settled into attritional nature, as both sides dug in, basically, as large-scale maneuvering became very difficult because the number of these military-grade as well as commercial-grade intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and combat assets, especially aerial drones, as they became more and more numerous, the battlefield became more and more transparent by the day. And so soon enough, it was not possible to mass your forces in very large numbers.
Yep.
It wasn't possible to make a significant breakthrough by a large conventional style military force because, first of all, your adversary would have these aerial assets in place. They would have ISR drones, combat drones, surveillance drones, and other assets. They would actually dig in and actually be ready for the advances. They would essentially do everything possible to negate the adversary from massing in one form or another. And so this became evident in 2022, but really kind of came to the fore in the Ukrainian advance that did not pan out in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
Because Russians were ready, because Ukraine took a long time to plan it, but also because a lot of these assets that we're discussing, both military grade and commercial grade, were already in the air and provided lots of visibility to the battlefront.
Sure.
And then from that point going forward to today, essentially anything that moves at that tactical edge, right? Basically 0 to 10 or 15 kilometers from the line of contact, right? That gray zone in each direction. Anything that moves there will be observed, will be tracked, and ultimately attacked by a drone. And that's what we're seeing on Telegram. That's what we're seeing on social media. Obviously, not all of these attacks are successful.
Yep.
A lot of them are not. Most of them are not. But what we see as successful has an impact as well. And sort of we can guesstimate and make our own judgment about the technologies and tactics that we're actually witnessing. In 2022, I quoted one of the retired Russian military officials as saying that DJI quadcopter has elevated Russian artillery to the levels not seen since World War I and made artillery as precise as a sniper rifle. That may have been a bit of an exaggeration, but that sort of indicated how the Russian military was viewing this convergence of military-grade systems and tactics with these do-it-yourself DIY commercial-grade volunteer-type efforts that began to flood the front line unevenly. But again, that also had an impact.
You know, what's interesting is my first company was a counter-UAS company, right? And Naval Special Warfare found us when they were fighting ISIS. And the US commanders said almost the same thing as that Russian commander, that ISIS's mortar teams and artillery was so precise because they were using DJI quadcopters, right? To basically be able to adjust it on the fly and really like bring in, you know, the failure rate and really be able to get precise with this stuff. So it's funny that 10 years later, or I guess ironic 10 years later, you know, we're having to learn the lessons over again in a sense, right?
That's not a bug; it's almost a feature at this point.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually what I want to pull a string on that a little bit. Okay, so you said in 2022, this is really when this started to kick off. You know what I mean? And so now we find ourselves in 25, right? It's almost 3 years since the start of the war. How much of a part of the kind of military and tactical culture is this fusion that you're describing? Like, I mean, is this just intrinsic now? Are both of these militaries, no matter what happens, going to operate this way? Are they going to be drawing from commercial technologies to improve everything? I mean, where do you think this goes from here?
So that's an interesting concept, simply because relying on commercial technology means you are relying on supply chains and all kinds of issues that relate to that commercial technology. So if China suddenly decides to pull all of its DJI drones from the market, it won't do that because it controls that commercial market. But if it decides to do that, for example, then both sides are left holding the bag.
Yep.
So you can't really rely on commercial technologies to that extent, but you can learn from them. Because again, the commercial sector is always going to be more nimble, more adaptive, and more reactive, much faster than your typical government or the defense industrial sector, defense industrial enterprise, right? And I think that's probably the case for all countries around the world, no matter how big or small their militaries are. But you need to learn how smaller startups can innovate, can iterate, can evolve very quickly, and how they can impact and influence the military technology that's used to the front. And so I think both Ukraine and Russia going forward, certainly Ukraine, are going to learn from this experience and build technology similar to commercial tech that has been so prevalent. So, for example, Ukraine has advertised multiple quadcopter projects that aim to replace China's DJI. So they don't rely on China, they don't depend on China. They actually make it in-house and then build it for military applications, meaning it will have to come with certain concepts and defenses like getting it proofed against electronic warfare jamming and similar systems. In Russia, I think situation is a bit murky. This is the discussion right now between some of these volunteer and startup enterprises that have since matured into robust and fairly sizable enterprise efforts, nationwide enterprise efforts, right? And between the defense industrial sector. And certainly Russia's Rostec and similar defense giants are certainly looking at what was done by these volunteers, but they're not necessarily looking to be led by these volunteers, right? Mm-hmm. They will probably absorb a lot of these efforts. They will absorb the lessons. And because the government and the MOD is now directing the defense industrial sector in Russia to better cooperate with this larger volunteer startup space, they're going to take probably the best lessons and maybe leave a number of these startups and mature enterprises as sort of this domestic private sector high tech on a very small scale to be the bellwether of change in the activity that they can then adapt. Again, this all goes back to how the military operates. The reason why the acquisition process is so long is because the testing and evaluation takes this long, right? It can take years. In Ukraine, that testing and evaluation acquisition cycle has shrunk to mere months and sometimes even weeks, and changes could be done literally on the fly, no pun intended, when it comes to drones.
Sure.
Here's an example of how this looks. So Russians were the first movers in fielding fiber optic control drones. In the Kursk region in August of last year, an enterprise called Ushkuinik, which was founded by Alexei Chadaev, who is a volunteer and one of the key Russian personalities sort of leading this volunteer effort as someone who promotes this type of activity. So his Ushkuinik enterprise fielded Vandal-Novgorodsky fiber optic control drone in Kursk. So they were the first movers, and Ukraine very quickly caught on, and they're now fielding different fiber optic control drone types, and Russians are concerned that Ukraine may actually field more of these ultimately. But Vandal-Novgorodsky drone didn't come from a large defense industrial enterprise. That breakthrough technology didn't come from a large mega corporation, didn't come from Rostec, it didn't come from Kalashnikov, it didn't come from the likes of large enterprises. It came from this startup accelerator, if you will, and it came in small numbers, but it very quickly demonstrated its utility and usefulness, which is now sort of built upon by Ushkuinik now saying that we will build these drones across Russia at multiple locations to scale it up, and Ukrainians now fielding at least a dozen different types of fiber optic control drones.
That type of scaling up, is that going to be done at small, medium enterprises, at mom and pop shops? Like when they say something like that on the Russian side, how do they scale production?
I think at the tactical level, there's a lot of awareness what has to be done. And if you read the Telegram channels, many of them actually are quite critical still of the MOD, of the higher echelons, and of what we call here in the West the frozen middle. A single drone can cost $1 million. And what happens if you lose that, right? How quickly can you replace something that costs $1 million versus fielding something that costs maybe $10,000 at the most, or a few $1,000s, or even $1,000?
Thanks for listening to the Drone Wars podcast. Each week, we bring you fascinating conversations with leaders shaping the future of air, sea, land, and space technologies. Catch new episodes every Tuesday wherever podcasts can be found. Until then, we'll see you next time.